I just went through my personal hell. 2 HOA enforcers aimed their firearms at my spouse over a minor parking dispute. They insisted they were simply instructing her on the regulations. What they were unaware of was that she instructs Green Berets in techniques to overpower men double their build. But allow me to commence from the outset. The initial error was Bartholomew, the yard sale gnome that Heather adopted since he appeared isolated. The second misstep was positioning him in Serenity Oaks, a colorful detention facility masquerading as a suburban area governed by this HOA despot named Karen. On a Tuesday, a piece of ivory paper was pushed beneath our entrance. It declared, "Your pottery yard decoration breaches Regulation 7C, object not in accord with our communal norms." In other words, Karen's fidgety gaze noticed Bart's crimson cap. Enclosed was a $1.25 penalty and a photo of the gnome encircled in red as if a criminal. I quipped about a forthcoming fee for disharmonious respiration. Heather merely whispered, "It's a test, she's probing our boundaries." I understood her implication. We'd resided in Serenity Oaks for merely half a year. We were the fresh arrivals. Karen managed the HOA as her private domain. She possessed her council, a group of anxious, appearing males and females who affirmed every time she uttered, and seemed perpetually terrified she could penalize them for blinking excessively leisurely. We'd listened to tales from fellow residents, shared in murmurs across barriers. Accounts of penalties for garbage bins remaining out 10 minutes excessively. Penalties for hosting a cookout on a Wednesday. Penalties for children's playthings visible from the road. It was ludicrous. Yet most individuals simply settled. They complained, but they settled. It was simpler than contesting her. Contesting her required attending the monthly HOA gatherings, which were evidently less a discussion and more a communal humiliation event overseen by Sovereign Karen personally. I am inherently a wise guy. It's a protective strategy, but I also prefer a serene existence. I merely desired to barbecue my patties, view my games, and reside with my lovely, alarmingly skilled spouse in tranquility. So, what shall we do? I inquired, shall we pay the gnome's bailout? Shall we relocate him to the rear yard where her spying vision cannot observe him? Heather inserted the blade into its timber holder. The noise was a gentle, conclusive thud. "We settle it," she stated. "This occasion we provide her the $1.25, but we do not relocate the gnome. We inform her we'll adhere to the documented guidelines, but we won't be intimidated." It appeared a solid strategy, a balanced reply. My spouse is a tactician. She doesn't intensify, she sets limits. I, conversely, was already contemplating purchasing Bartholomew, a minuscule placard that read, "Bring it on, Karen." I composed the payment that afternoon. I placed it in the packet, and right before I secured it, I inscribed a brief remark on the notation line for gnome-associated extortion. It was trivial, I realize, but it improved my mood. I strolled it over the road and deposited it in her postbox personally. As I pivoted to depart, I observed the drape in her forward pane flutter. She was observing. I offered a small gesture. I knew profoundly this wasn't the conclusion. This was a summons. She had discharged a cautionary blast. And we had retaliated with a $1.25 payment and a mute pottery gesture of resistance. The conflict for Serenity Oaks had initiated, and the initial loss was my bank balance. I merely wished it wouldn't be the final since, as I ambled back to my residence, I sensed Karen was merely commencing. And I couldn't dispel the sensation that this wasn't solely about a gnome any longer. It was regarding dominance, and I was beginning to ponder how distant she was prepared to proceed to obtain it. Permit me to explain why we relocated to Serenity Oaks. It wasn't for the spirit, dampening neutral palate or the excitement of HOA statutes. It was for the silence. Following years in a confined urban flat where the alarms were our bedtime tunes, and our upper neighbors were a clan of expert clog performers, we desired calm. We desired a garden. We desired to station our vehicle without looping the area for 60 minutes. I'm an author. I operate from residence. My largest conflicts are typically with a resistant section or a flashing indicator. I require a specific degree of calmness to persuade the terms to emerge. Heather, well, she's distinct. She doesn't require silence. She can generate her own silence, if you grasp my meaning. She could likely contemplate amid a music performance. But she desired a location where she could unwind, a location that didn't resemble a combat area, because she'd witnessed sufficient of those for multiple existences. She was a Green Beret, not an ex-Green Beret. Once you acquire that cap, it's component of you eternally. She was a trainer now, educating the subsequent cohort of America's premier tough guys in the subtle craft of near-range fighting. She'd returned from a day of instructing individuals how to fracture bones and nullify dangers, and all she desired was to perch on the veranda with a cup of chilled beverage and not have to contemplate her risk assessment. We encountered in a bookshop of all sights. I was in the past aisle, searching for a volume on ancient assault devices. She was in the personal growth aisle, which I found amusing subsequently. She was seeking a volume on horticulture. She was attired in casual attire, a plain tee and denim, but she progressed with an intent that you don't observe in most individuals. She didn't meander, she maneuvered, she extended for a volume on heritage tomatoes. Simultaneously as I did, our fingers grazed. I uttered something witty like, "Apologies, are you likewise plotting a tomato-oriented attack?" She didn't chuckle. She merely provided me that gaze, the evaluative one. No, she stated tomatoes are for condiments, not for attacks. They possess low speed and inferior flight dynamics. Then she grinned slightly, and that was it. I was finished. She was the most proficient, assured, and truly decent individual I had ever encountered. She was robust, but she was also compassionate. She was regimented, but she possessed a sly wit that would ambush you. She was the foundation of my existence. She made me sense secure, not merely bodily, but secure enough to be my ironic, silly self. She was my comrade in conflict, the one individual I'd enter any skirmish with, even one battled with HOA alerts. When we initially relocated into the area, it was precisely what we'd anticipated. Individuals were amicable. They'd gesture when you passed. Our adjacent resident, an elderly fellow named Mr. Henderson, delivered us a pastry. The HOA was a subtle buzz, a required nuisance that ensured nobody colored their residence vivid rose. The leader at the period was a relaxed fellow named Dave, who primarily concerned about the communal swimming area's acidity balance. Then Dave and his spouse departed for retirement and relocated to Florida. And that's when the gloom arrived. That's when Karen was chosen. It was an unchallenged selection. No one else desired the position. We didn't even realize it was occurring until we received a bulletin with her image in it. She had a firm curl and a grin that didn't touch her gaze. Her agenda, as far as I could discern, was to render Serenity Oak tranquil once more, which appeared to entail numerous guidelines and minimal tranquility. The initial alterations were minor. The bulletins lengthened. The manner shifted from friendly to slightly menacing. A prompt, they would state, that all refuse containers must be restored to their assigned storage spot by 7:00 p.m. On pickup day, offenders will be liable to implementation, liable to implementation. It resonated so formal, so foreboding. Then arrived the fresh groups, the structural assessment group, the scenery and accord group, the area surveillance group, which everyone swiftly discovered was merely Karen cruising in her golf vehicle with a set of field glasses. My pal Trevor resided 2 avenues away. He's a decent fellow, but he's a career fretter. He perceives plots everywhere. He was the initial to raise the alert. "Mark, you observe this," he'd state, brandishing the recent HOA bulletin. The scenery and accord group. What is this, a cloister? Are they going to penalize me because my petunias aren't contemplating? I'd chuckle it away. Relax, Trevor. It's merely a cluster of idle folks with excessive leisure. But then Trevor received a penalty because his yard tube was not wound in a flawlessly round manner. He displayed me the image they dispatched him. His tube was wound in a marginally elliptical manner. The penalty was $50. That's when Heather began noticing. She's educated to observe configurations, to identify intensifying dangers. I observe a mad woman with a measurer. She observes a methodical collapse of communal standards being substituted by dictatorial dominance. She's solidifying authority, she stated one night, examining the bulletin. She's forming a framework. All these groups, they're her deputies. She's constructing a force. I thought she was being somewhat theatrical. A force of landscapers and designers. What were they going to do? Hurl begonias at us. But as typical, she was envisioning 3 steps forward, while I was still attempting to decipher the initial one. The gnome penalty wasn't the commencement. It was merely the initial occasion the conflict had arrived at our threshold. Prior to that, it was a remote clash, something occurring to others like Trevor and his elliptical tube. But now we were in Karen's sights. Bartholomew the gnome was our banner in the soil, and by declining to relocate him, we had unwittingly enlisted for the vanguard. Heather recognized it. She perceived the tactic, the exploratory assault. All I perceived was an absurd correspondence, but I was acquiring knowledge. I was beginning to comprehend that in a location named Serenity Oaks, calm was something you had to battle for, and the adversary wasn't some overseas authority. It was a female across the road with a curl, a golf vehicle, and a desire for total dominance. A week following the gnome event, the conflict intensified. It was no longer a chilly conflict, battled with indirect hostile notations on payments. It transformed into a drive of mental combat. And Karen's initial objective was my award-winning flowers. All right, they weren't award-winning. They hadn't secured any awards, but they were my flowers, and I was proud of them. Heather had assisted me in sowing the shrubs when we initially relocated. It was our endeavor. She excavated the cavities with armed forces accuracy while I supplied ironic remarks and citrus drink. Now they were gorgeous, profound crimson flowers, the dimension of my hand. They were, I believed, very in accord. Evidently Karen differed. I emerged one dawn to retrieve the journal, and I detected something synthetic, a severe, acrid odor, and my flower shrubs were drooping. The foliage were golden and twisted, and the gorgeous crimson flowers were shifting to a diseased tan. They appeared as if they'd been doused with toxin, because they had been. There, resting on the turf beside the shrubs, was a small, vacant container of commercial, level plant destroyer. The type you're supposed to thin. This wasn't thinned. This was a synthetic onslaught. My initial reaction was fury, pure, scorching, unreflecting ire. I desired to stride across the road, smash down Karen's impeccably neutral entrance, and request recompense. I desired to inquire her what sort of wretched individual derives pleasure from slaying blossoms, but then I observed Heather. She was positioned on the veranda, a cup of java in her grasp. She was examining the flowers, then at the container, then at Karen's residence. She was utterly motionless. She wasn't furious. She was computing. Don't, she stated, her voice subdued and stable. She knew precisely what I was contemplating. That's what she desires. She desires you to forfeit your composure. She desires you to shout and holler. She desires to be able to summon the authorities and state her insane new resident is menacing her. She sipped her java. She abandoned the container deliberately. It's a communication. The communication was evident. I can contact you anytime I wish. I can ruin what you cherish, and there's nothing you can do about it. So what? We just permit her to escape with it. I inquired, my voice strained. We can't verify it was her. No, Heather stated, we can't, not in a manner that will endure. An officer would label this defacement. They'd compile a document, and that would be the conclusion of it. It's her statement versus ours. She descended the stairs and retrieved the vacant container with a cloth from her pouch. She inspected it, rotating it in her grasp. But we can initiate our own dossier. That's what she termed it, a dossier. Not a vendetta, not a reprisal scheme, a dossier. It was so characteristic of her. Systematic, impartial. She was tackling our area disagreement like a counter-espionage mission. We captured images of the deceased flowers. We captured images of the container. We enclosed the container in a synthetic sack and marked it with the date and hour. It felt formal. It felt like we were retaliating. Even though all we were doing was collecting proof for offense no one would ever pursue. That afternoon I encountered Trevor. He was brisk strolling past my residence, his visage pallid and perspiring. He observed my flowers and halted abruptly. "Oh, dude," he exhaled, his eyes broad. "She targeted you as well." "What do you imply as well?" I inquired. Trevor glanced around apprehensively, as if anticipating Karen to emerge from behind a shrub. Her fresh surveillance, he murmured. The adherence surveillance, 2 fellows in identical shirts. They visited yesterday, stated my bird fountain was drawing non-local bird types. What does that even signify? Am I supposed to erect a small placard that says native birds solely? He was agitating his cranium. They inadvertently toppled it, shattered it. It was a present from my mom. It was the identical configuration. Credible refutability. Ruin of belongings camouflaged as an awkward mishap. A straightforward communication of coercion. Karen had subordinates now. She had delegated her unclean tasks. This was the genuine, sparking event. The gnome was a jest. This was distinct. This was spiteful. This was an assault on our residence, on our small portion of calm. Heather and I seated that evening at the cooking surface. We had our dossier before us. An image of a gnome, an image of deceased flowers, a synthetic sac with a toxin container. This is a drive, Heather stated, her voice somber. It's crafted to exhaust us. She'll continue pressing gradually until we fracture and vend the residence. To whom? I inquired. Who desire to purchase a residence in this madhouse. Someone who doesn't object, she stated. Or someone who's obtaining a truly fine bargain. A shiver descended my backbone. This wasn't merely an authority journey any longer. It felt larger, more structured. I gazed at my spouse. The descending sun was capturing the gleams in her locks. She appeared fatigued, but her gaze was lucid and resolute. This was the existence we had selected, the silent existence, and we weren't going to be expelled from it by a trivial despot and her thug team. So what's our subsequent action, Sergeant? I inquired. She provided me a small, firm grin. We proceed to the protective, she stated. We fortify the objective. It resonated like something from an espionage film. But this wasn't a film. This was our existence, and we were formally behind adversary positions. The query was, what would the adversary do next now that they recognized we weren't retreating? Fortifying the objective commenced. Recorders, Heather was resolute. She's employing credible refutability, she clarified as we strolled through the corridors of a large retail electronics outlet. Our task is to refute her the credible. We acquired a setup with 4 high-resolution recorders, 1 for the forward veranda centered on the entrance, 1 for the driveway, 1 supervising my now deceased flower plot, and 1 for the rear yard. I felt somewhat absurd. We were converting our suburban residence into a stronghold. I half anticipated to be setting up a ditch and a lift bridge subsequently. I made a quip about it. Should we acquire some razor wire for the barrier, perhaps some explosives for the grass? That would likely infringe the organic visual regulation. Heather didn't grin. She was in assignment mode. Explosives are untidy and necessitate authorizations. She stated flatly, razor wire is an option, but let's adhere to monitoring for now. Occasionally I couldn't discern when she was jesting. Setting up the recorders was my task. I'm fairly adept with a bore. As I was elevated on a step stool by the forward entrance, Karen's golf vehicle approached stealthily down the road. It progressed with an eerie quietude like a predator. She decelerated as she traversed our residence. Her gaze fastened on me and the recorder I was affixing. She didn't gesture. She didn't grin. She merely gazed. It was an expression of pure, undiluted hatred. It was the expression of a monarch who had just witnessed one of her vassals constructing an execution device in his forward garden. I provided her a large, amicable gesture, the type of gesture that says, "Hello, resident, I observe you observing me. Isn't suburban existence magnificent?" She compressed her lips into a slender line and accelerated. The communication was dispatched. We were observing her, observing us. The strain in the area increased a level. You could sense it. Individuals were strolling their canines somewhat quicker. The amicable gestures between residents became tentative small-digit movements. Everyone was fearful of being observed by Karen or her fresh adherents' surveillance. The surveillance comprised 2 fellows. They were burly with broad necks and the sort of lifeless gaze that implied they had flunked the law enforcement school admission test. They donned sharp indigo-collared shirts with the Serenity Oak choking vine emblem stitched on the breast. They cruised in a pale automobile with HOA adherents inscribed on the flank. It appeared formal sufficient to be daunting, but counterfeit sufficient to be comical. They didn't possess any genuine power naturally. They were merely intimidators in attire, but in an area filled with individuals who merely desired to be undisturbed, intimidators were potent. We observed them capturing images of individuals' residences. We observed them depositing infringement alerts for items like a kid's cycle abandoned on a grass or a banner that was discolored. Trevor was an anxious mess. He commenced contacting me daily with reports. Mark, they're present again. They're gauging the elevation of Mrs. Gable's postbox, gauging it with a measuring strip. This is how it commences, dude, first. They gauge your postbox. Next, they're gauging you for an incarceration outfit. Trevor, relax. I'd state they're merely attempting to frighten individuals. It's succeeding, he'd shriek, and it was. The penalties commenced accumulating throughout the area. $50 for this, $100 for that, it was. Perpetual mild harassment, a conflict of 1,000 document incisions, and individuals were becoming exhausted. We learned that 2 clans on the adjacent road had listed their residences for vending. They had endured sufficient. Heather perceived it as a triumph for Karen. She's prevailing, she stated one evening as we viewed the real-time transmission from our recorders on the screen. She's expelling them. Then it became individual once more. A parcel I was anticipating, a scarce volume I'd requested for my investigation, never materialized. The monitoring data stated it was conveyed and abandoned on the veranda, but it wasn't present. Our fresh recorder footage narrated the tale. The conveyance operator abandoned the parcel at 10:05 a.m. At 10:15 a.m., the pale HOA adherent automobile rolled past our residence. It decelerated, then accelerated. The parcel was absent. The recorder perspective wasn't impeccable. You couldn't observe one of them exit and seize it, but the parcel was present. Then they passed, and then it wasn't. It was larceny, straightforward. This occasion, we summoned the lawman. A subordinate arrived. He was youthful, appeared uninterested. We displayed him the recording. He viewed it, exhaled, and passed us a document. You can complete a document, he stated, but frankly, there is not much we can accomplish. You can't observe anyone seize it. Could have been a veranda thief. Occurs constantly. It was the HOA fellows, I maintained. They were tormenting us. The subordinate provided me a fatigued expression. Sir, we receive calls regarding this HOA constantly. It's a non-criminal issue. As long as they don't bodily attack you, it's between you and the Property Owners Association. That was it. The framework wasn't merely biased against us. It was vigorously disregarding us. The authorities perceived it as a trivial argument, but we recognized it was more. They were pilfering our correspondence. They were demolishing our belongings. They were methodically frightening an whole area, and no one was going to halt them. That evening, Karen strolled her small canine past our residence. She halted on the walkway directly in front of our recorder and gazed straight into the optic. Then she grinned, a broad, victorious, chilling grin. It was a proclamation of success. She recognized we couldn't contact her. She recognized she would be on the law because she was functioning in an ambiguous zone just below it. She was inviolable. As I viewed her on the display, a chilly terror settled in my abdomen. This was her contest, and she was executing it impeccably. And for the initial occasion, I sensed a glimmer of genuine fear. Not for my belongings, not for my funds, but for our security. How do you combat an adversary who has no guidelines when you're attempting to adhere to them? The recorders were observing, but what benefit was proof if no one would respond to it? The sensation of being observed is a peculiar thing. It's a primitive impulse. The hairs on the rear of your neck rise. You sense a force, a burden. After Karen's grinning display for our recorders, that sensation became an enduring component of our existences. We were existing in an aquarium. Every occasion we departed the residence, the pale automobile was present, stationed down the road. Every occasion we labored in the garden, Karen would materialize on her veranda observing us. It was a conflict of exhaustion, and it was succeeding. I was forfeiting concentration on my authoring. My sheets were filled with partially shaped phrases and furious doodles about grass upkeep. Heather was strained. She attempted to conceal it, but I could observe it in the position of her mandible, in the manner she'd continually survey the road when she exited her vehicle. The silent existence we desired was a remote recollection. Our residence had become a stronghold. It was Trevor who discovered the crucial. Trevor, in his eternal condition of mild alarm, had become the area's unofficial reconnaissance agent. He expended his days on his machine, cross-checking communal documents and delving into plot hypothesis discussions. Most of it was absurdity. He once informed me with total earnestness that he believed Karen was a reptile being. I informed him her character was cold-hearted sufficient, but I questioned she had flakes. But one day he contacted me and his voice was distinct. It wasn't his usual shrill alarm. It was a subdued, pressing murmur. Mark, I discovered something genuine, in this occasion, not reptile beings material. What is it, Trevor? I exhaled, prepared for another discourse on vapor trails. The residences, he stated, the ones that have vended in the last half year, the 2 clans on Elm Avenue, the Hendersons who departed before you folks arrived, 4 other clans, 6 residences in sum. I was merely inquisitive who was acquiring them, you recognize, assumed it was merely other individuals seeking the silent existence. I could hear him inputting vigorously, it's not diverse individuals, it's one purchaser. All 6 estates were acquired by a solitary unit. A chilly sensation washed over me. Who? I inquired. A firm, Trevor stated. A facade company. It's termed Oak Haven Growth Collective. I researched them. They were established 8 months prior, right after Karen assumed control of the HOA. They possess no online presence, no contact number, just a mail receptacle in the adjacent municipality. My thoughts was dashing. This altered everything. This wasn't regarding authority journey. This wasn't regarding a trivial despot obtaining her thrills. This was regarding funds, large funds. Heather was correct. Karen wasn't merely expelling individuals. She was expelling them for a purpose. She was generating openings. She was lowering estate worths with a rule of fear, making individuals so eager to depart that they'd vend for less than their residence was valued. And Oak Haven Growth Collective was present to acquire them. Trevor, you're a prodigy, I stated. And for the initial occasion, I meant it without a hint of irony. Dispatch me everything you possess. He emailed me the connections to the communal estate documents. It was all present in monochrome. 6 residences, all vended to the identical anonymous company. The acquisition costs were low, outrageously low for an area like ours. These clans had been compressed until they burst and then acquired for cents on the currency. Heather entered from a jog. I observed the expression on her visage. She'd observed the pale automobile following her for the final 2 kilometers. I didn't have to utter anything. I merely rotated the machine display toward her. She perused the display, her gaze shifting rapidly, assimilating the information, the dossier, our small dossier of complaints, the gnome, the flowers, the pilfered parcel abruptly felt insignificant. We had been concentrated on the troops. We had entirely overlooked the genuine conflict. This wasn't an aerial disagreement. It was an antagonistic acquisition. It's a territory seizure, she stated, her voice level. A organized endeavor to acquire the whole area. But why? I inquired. What's so unique about Serenity Oaks? Heather strolled over to the pane and gazed out at Karen's residence. I don't recognize. But someone is prepared to go to unlawful extents to obtain it. Karen is the point of the lance. She's the mallet, but she's not the designer. It was an astonishing disclosure, a significant turn in our foolish small suburban tale. We weren't combating a solitary female with a curl. We were combating a specter, a mute, affluent, and completely merciless company that was utilizing our HOA leader as its private force. The penalties, the coercion, the defacement, it was all merely a commercial method, a way to reduce functioning expenses. The product wasn't residences. It was human suffering. They were acquiring individuals' tranquility of thought, and the cost was inexpensive. We had a title now, Oak Haven Growth Collective, but a title was all we had. We had no notion who was behind it, what their ultimate objective was. Were they planning to demolish the area and construct a retail center, a tall apartment structure? The options were infinite and frightening. All we recognized for certain was that our small residence, our small section of verdant turf, and our now deceased flower shrubs was obstructing a multi-million currency real estate plot. And the individuals behind it had already demonstrated they were prepared to violate the law to obtain what they desired. The contest had altered. The risks were greater than we ever conceived. We weren't merely combating for our residents any longer. We were combating an unseen adversary for the essence of our whole area, and we had a frightening new query to resolve. Who was Oak Haven Growth Collective? The disclosure about Oak Haven Growth Collective left us in a condition of hanging terror. It was like discovering the creature beneath your bed is genuine and it possesses a commercial permit. Our small conflict with Karen abruptly appeared charming. She was merely a marionette, a noisy, irritating, curl-adorned marionette. The genuine issue was the marionneer, the obscure unit pulling the cords from a mail receptacle in the adjacent municipality. For a few days we did nothing. We merely observed and we contemplated. The burden of the finding was oppressive. How could we, two individuals, combat an anonymous company? They had funds, they had attorneys, they had Karen and her thug team. We had a dossier full of minor offenses and a suspicious resident who thought the world was governed by reptile beings. The probabilities were not in our favor. One dusk, Heather and I were perched on the rear veranda. It was twilight. The heavens was a contused violet and amber. The quietude in the area was heavy, unnatural. It wasn't calm. It was apprehensive. We could vend. I stated softly, testing the terms. We could merely depart, let them possess it, reduce our deficits, and locate another silent location. I didn't desire to. The notion left a bitter flavor in my mouth, but I had to utter it. I had to gaze at my spouse, who had expended her existence rushing toward difficulty to safeguard individuals, and inquire if this was a battle worth possessing. How distant was I prepared to proceed to protect this section of turf? Was I prepared to hazard her security, my security, for a residence, for a principle? It was the nucleus of it all, the query that had been lingering in the rear of my thoughts since the initial penalty materialized. What was the boundary? Heather was mute for an extended period, observing the lightning bugs begin to flicker in the increasing obscurity. I contemplated about my sibling, how we used to confront intimidators in the playground for children who couldn't. He always stated, "You don't battle because you believe you can prevail. You battle because you must, because permitting them to prevail is a sort of demise." No, Heather stated ultimately. Her voice was gentle, but it was constructed of metal. "We don't flee. If we flee, they prevail. And they'll merely do this to the subsequent area and the subsequent. This isn't merely about our residents any longer, Mark. It's about individuals like Trevor and the Gables and the unfortunate clans who got frightened away." She pivoted to gaze at me, her gaze intense in the faint illumination. "This is our residence. You don't surrender your residence without a battle. The query isn't if we battle, the query is how," and just like that, the uncertainty vanished. She was correct. We weren't casualties, we were guardians. This was our territory. The ethical intersection was behind us. We had selected our route. We were going to retaliate. But how? The judicial framework had disappointed us. The authorities were ineffective. Going directly against a company and tribunal would impoverish us. We required a fresh tactic. We required to cease playing protection and proceed to the assault. We can't battle them on their territory. Heather stated, her tactical thoughts activating. We can't surpass them in lawyering and we can't outspend them. We have to battle them on ours. What's our territory? I inquired. Within our residence data, she stated. Deceit. We recognize who they are, but they don't recognize that we recognize. That's our benefit. They believe we're just another duo of exasperated property owners. They believe they're gradually heating us like amphibians. They have no notion the amphibians are recording observations. Her scheme began to shape. It was audacious. It was perilous. It was pure Heather. We required to discover who was behind Oak Haven, and to do that, we required to infiltrate Karen's operation. The scheme had two components, my component and her component. My component was the lure snare, not the amorous type, the data type. I was going to execute the one thing I was proficient at, being a wise guy. I was going to attend the subsequent HOA gathering, but I wasn't going to attend to grumble. I was going to attend to capitulate. I was going to brandish the pale banner, express regret for being challenging, and inquire what I required to do to regain Karen's favor. I was going to attempt to get near to her, to make her believe she had finally shattered me. It was a hazardous action. It meant consuming the entire lot of humility. But if I could get her to trust me, even slightly, she might disclose something. She might reference a title, a location, anything we could utilize to decipher the enigma of Oak Haven. Heather's component was more straightforward. She was going to employ her abilities, not her fighting abilities, her monitoring and penetration abilities. The HOA adherents thugs had a schedule. They encountered Karen every dawn in the parking area of the communal swimming spot to receive their tasks for the day. They were careless. They were conceited. They abandoned their automobile unsecured. Heather was going to install a eavesdropping apparatus in their automobile. A eavesdropper. It was unlawful. It was perilous. If she got apprehended, we'd be the ones heading to incarceration, not them. We discussed it for hours. We evaluated the hazards. We were traversing a boundary. We were violating the law to combat individuals who were violating the law. It was an untidy, ambiguous zone, but it was the sole choice we had remaining. The resolution was made, the scheme was established, we were no longer responding, we were initiating, we were bringing the battle to them. As we proceeded inside that evening, a fresh sensation substituted the terror. It was a chilly, firm determination. We recognized we were stepping off a precipice. We just didn't recognize how distant we were going to descend. The HOA gathering was conducted in the communal clubhouse, a barren chamber that odorized of bleach and subdued hopelessness. It was everything I envisioned. Karen perched at an extended surface at the front, flanked by her council of affirming toadies. She appeared like a magistrate overseeing a proceeding where all the accused were already culpable. The 20 or so property owners in the crowd appeared defeated, their visages a blend of bitterness and acceptance. I occupied a seat in the rear. Heather was at residence supervising our recorders and preparing for her own assignment. My pulse was throbbing. I'm an author, not a performer. My scheme to portray the role of a shattered man felt fragile, ridiculous. But then Karen commenced speaking, and her arrogant, patronizing voice filled me with abrupt, clarifying fury. It was like an injection of energy. I could accomplish this. I could deceive this female's visage, for Heather, for Trevor, for my poor slain flowers. I awaited until the communal remark segment at the conclusion of the gathering. One by one, my residents rose to timidly grumble about a penalty or request explanation on some absurd fresh guideline. Karen closed each of them with a flick of her arm or a sharp, incisive comment. The guidelines are quite lucid, Mr. Johnson. Perhaps you should peruse the statutes you consented to when you acquired your residence. It was an expert lesson in trivial despotism. Finally, it was my opportunity. I rose. The chamber went mute. Everyone recognized who I was. I was the gnome fellow, the deceased flowers fellow. I was the resistance. Karen's gaze constricted. She inclined forward, a hunter detecting an ultimate clash. Mr. Miller, she stated, her voice oozing with counterfeit amiability. Do you have something to contribute? I inhaled deeply. Yes, Karen, I do. I observed her recoil when I utilized her given name. I am present tonight to express regret. A whisper traversed the assembly. Karen's arrogant expression wavered, substituted by a glimmer of bewilderment. I've been challenging, I proceeded, permitting my shoulders to droop. I haven't been a group participant. This community possesses guidelines for a purpose, to preserve our estate worths and our accord. And I haven't been in accord. I was applying it densely, but it appeared to be succeeding. The council members were gazing at me with sympathy. Karen was gazing at me with success. She had prevailed. She had shattered the insurgent. My spouse and I, we just desire to place all this behind us. I stated, my voice fracturing slightly, we'll settle all the pending penalties, we'll eliminate the gnome. We just desire to be good residents. I ceded. The quietude was overwhelming. Karen gazed at me for an extended instant, her small rodent wheel of an intellect evidently attempting to process this abrupt capitulation. Finally, a gradual victorious grin extended across her visage. Well, Mr. Miller, she stated, that's very magnanimous of you. Regret accepted. She had seized the lure completely. While I was presenting my award, deserving act, Heather was implementing her own scheme. Under the veil of obscurity, attired in ebony from cranium to foot, she progressed like a phantom through the area. She glided through rear gardens, utilizing the darkness as her concealment. She was verse in action. I observed her on our protection recorders, a mute, lethal specter progressing through the slumbering outskirts. She arrived at the communal swimming area parking zone. The pale automobile was present, vacant. She surveyed the vicinity. No one. She progressed swiftly. Using a slender piece of metal, she had the automobile entrance open in less than 3 seconds. She glided inside, positioned a minuscule magnetically attached GPS locator and eavesdropping apparatus under the rider's seat, and was out again in less than 10 seconds. The automobile was secured. No indication she had ever been present. Assignment completed. She was midway residence when it occurred. One of the adherents' surveillance thugs emerged from the clubhouse. He must have overlooked something. He observed her. An obscure figure progressing rapidly across the border of the parking zone. He yelled, "Hey, you halt!" Heather didn't halt. She erupted into a complete dash. He commenced pursuing her. This was not component of the scheme. This was a disastrous malfunction. My device vibrated in my pouch. A message from her. One term, endangered. My blood chilled. I was still in the gathering. I had to continue portraying my role. I observed Karen gaze toward the entrance, irritated at the yelling outside. The thug was awkward, but he was large. He was advancing on Heather. She guided him away from our residence toward the forested park at the border of the area. She was attempting to lure him away from our headquarters. She vanished into the foliage. He pursued her in. The recorders couldn't observe them any longer. My pulse felt like it was going to pound its way out of my torso. I perched there attempting to appear remorseful and shattered, while my spouse, my entire universe, was being pursued through the foliage by a hoodlum. The eavesdropper was installed. The initial component of the assignment was a triumph, but the cost was frighteningly elevated. They recognized someone was prying around their automobile. They didn't recognize who, but they had observed a figure in the obscurity, and now one of them had my spouse trapped in the foliage. My thoughts was a shrieking turmoil of fear, but on the exterior, I had to be a monument of remorse. The HOA gathering finally compassionately concluded. Karen provided me a nauseatingly amiable grin as I departed. "I'm so delighted we've reached in comprehension, Mark," she stated. I merely affirmed, my throat too constricted to utter. I virtually sprinted residence, my thoughts replaying Heather's one-term message. Endangered. The residence was obscure, mute. My abdomen knotted into a tangle. Heather, I summoned, my voice resounding in the stillness. Nothing. I inspected the recorder transmissions. The parking zone was vacant. The foliage were ebony, illegible bulk. I was about to summon emergency to dam the repercussions when the rear entrance glided open. She glided inside as mute as a darkness. She wasn't even respiring heavily. There was an extended abrasion on her cheek and a rip in the arm of her ebony coat, but otherwise she was fine. I seized her, embraced her firmly. "Are you all right? What occurred? The thug, did he?" She placed a digit to my lips. "I'm fine," she murmured. "He's not." She guided me to the cooking area and poured a cup of liquid. He pursued me into the foliage. He was large but leisurely, foreseeable. He thought he had me trapped against the stream. He extracted a blade. My blood chilled. "A blade?" He signaled the action from a kilometer away, she stated, her voice composed and scientific, like she was reviewing a practice drill. I unarmed him. He tumbled, struck his cranium on a stone. "He'll have a migraine tomorrow," just like that. She'd nullified a danger, an armed male in obscurity, and was now composedly rehydrating in our cooking area. Occasionally, I overlooked just how proficient she was. My fear gradually diminished, substituted by admiration. "The crucial thing," she stated, shifting focus back to the assignment, "is that he didn't obtain a good view of my visage. But they recognize someone was present. They'll be on elevated vigilance. We need to examine the sound from that eavesdropper swiftly." We proceeded to my workspace and accessed the transmission from the eavesdropping apparatus. It was functioning. We could hear the two adherents thugs conversing and they drove away from the clubhouse. Their titles, we discovered, were Donnie and Frank, and they sounded frightened. "Did you observe him?" Donnie inquired, his voice trembling, progressed like a darn feline. By the occasion I entered the foliage, he was absent. I stumbled, struck my cranium, so that was the tale he was adopting. He'd stumbled. He was too humiliated to confess he'd been subdued. That was a fortunate break. Frank groaned. "Karen's going to be angry. Someone tampering with our automobile on a gathering evening. She's going to freak out." And then arrived the initial revelation. "Perhaps we should just inform the superior what occurred," Donnie stated. Frank mocked. "Are you insane? We don't converse to him directly." "No one converses to him directly. We converse to Karen. She converses to him. That's the arrangement. You recognize that." Heather and I gazed at each other. Him. Not Oak Haven Growth Collective, him. There was a male behind this, a solitary individual. Karen wasn't merely a marionette for a company, she was a marionette for a person. This was enormous. We continued listening. They drove for a few minutes, the dialogue shifting to athletics, to cuisine, to all the ordinary things assassins discuss on their way to labor. And then Frank's device rang. He placed it on loudspeaker. It was Karen, and she was enraged. "What is occurring?" she shrieked. "Donnie, you're informing me you permitted someone to escape. You had one task." "I'm apologetic, Karen." Donnie whined. "It was obscure. I stumbled. Ineffective." She spat. "Both of you, return here." The superior just advanced the schedule. He desires the final 2 resistors gone by the conclusion of the week. The final 2 resistors, that was us and resident Trevor. My pulse pounded against my ribs. They were approaching for us shortly. "What about the author?" Frank inquired. "Miller. He came groveling back tonight. Expressed regret for everything." Karen chuckled. "A noise like a braiding crystal." "Oh, I recognize it was pitiful, but the superior doesn't concern. He stated Miller's spouse is the genuine issue. He stated she's unforeseeable. He desires their residence vacant now." Then Karen uttered the terms that altered everything, the terms that twisted the entire circumstance into a tangle of individual frightening horror. "Don't fret about the funds," she stated, her voice descending to a plodding murmur. "Mr. Sterling is good for it. He always is." Sterling. The title struck me like a bodily impact. I sensed the air depart my lungs. I recognized that title. I recognized it all too well. Heather gazed at me, observed the hue drain from my visage. "Mark, what is it? Who is Mr. Sterling?" I couldn't utter. I merely directed a trembling digit at the wall of my workspace, at a framed image. It was a photo of me and my sibling David captured a decade prior. We were younger, grinning, positioned on a vessel. My sibling, who had severed all connection with our kin 5 years prior, after an acrimonious dispute over our parents' legacy. My sibling who had altered his surname, his fresh title was David Sterling. The world slanted on its pivot. The ground fell away and I was tumbling. My sibling, my own sibling, was the designer of this hell. It didn't make sense. It made a horrible ideal kind of sense. The dispute we had, it was unsightly. It was about funds. He'd charged me of defrauding him, of turning our parents against him. He was always suspicious, always thought someone was out to acquire him, to seize what was his. After our parents perished, he took his portion of the legacy, altered his title to Sterling, our mother's birth surname, and disappeared. I hadn't heard from him in 5 years. Now I recognized why. He hadn't just disappeared. He'd been simmering, scheming this entire elaborate plot, this corporate acquisition of an arbitrary suburban area. It wasn't about the territory. It wasn't about the funds. Not really, it was about me. He had discovered where I resided and had built this entire night, mere just for me to devastate me, to expel me from my residence, destitute and shattered. Karen, the HOA, the thugs, Oak Haven growth. They were all just instruments, tools of a profoundly individual, diseased reprisal. Heather observed it all in my visage. I didn't have to clarify. She placed her hand on my shoulder, a firm, anchoring burden. "Mark," she stated, her voice drawing me back from the brink. "Gaze at me." I encountered her gaze. They weren't filled with sympathy. They were filled with blaze. "This alters nothing," she stated. "It just provides the adversary a visage." But it altered everything for me. I was no longer combating an anonymous company. I was combating my own kin, my own past. How distant will a male proceed to protect his own? The query now had a dreadful new complication. What if the individual you're protecting yourself from is your own? We listened to the remainder of the recording from the eavesdropper. It was mostly Karen providing Donnie and Frank directives. They were to heighten the pressure, commence with Trevor, shatter his pains, gash his wheels, make it appear like arbitrary defacement. He's an anxious one. He'll yield. Karen commanded. Then she provided the command for us, for the Millers. The superior desires it to be a communication. He desires it to sting. He proposed a blaze, an electrical blaze, something that will consume the entire residence. They were going to incinerate our residence with us inside it. This had intensified from torment to attempted homicide, and my sibling was the one who provided the command. The worldly, fatigued component of me, the component that had observed the unsightly side of individuals in my investigation, wasn't entirely astonished. But the component of me that recalled playing toss with David in the rear garden sensed a deep, boundless sorrow. He wasn't just my adversary, he was a beast. We have to proceed to the authorities, I stated, my voice. Now we possess a recording, we possess his title. Heather agitated her cranium. No, contemplate it through. It's an unlawful interception. The recording is unacceptable in tribunal. It would get dismissed and we would be indicted. It's still our statement against theirs, a potent, affluent male against a fellow with a vendetta and his unforeseeable spouse. She was correct. We were still ensnared. We possessed the truth, but we couldn't utilize it. David had protected himself impeccably. He was a specter, communicating solely through Karen. There was no document path leading to him, nothing but a recording that could land us in incarceration. So what do? I inquired, sensing powerless. They're approaching for Trevor. They're approaching to incinerate our residence. Heather rose and commenced to stride. She wasn't alarming. She was scheming. She was a fighter preparing for combat. We can't halt them, she stated, so we permit them to approach. I gazed at her. Permit them to approach. Are you mad? They believe they're pursuing us, she stated, a somber grin on her visage. They believe we're trapped quarry. We're about to instruct them that they've been strolling into a snare this entire occasion. They desire to incinerate our residence. Fine. We'll be prepared for them. We're going to utilize their assault against them. We're going to capture them, all of them. Donnie, Frank, Karen, and your sibling. On our conditions, on our territory. Her scheme was frighteningly straightforward. We were going to strengthen the residents, not just with recorders, with snares, non-fatal, but potent. We were going to direct them, manage their progression, and document every single instant of it. We would obtain our proof, our pristine, lawful, irrefutable proof, and we were going to accomplish it this evening. The subsequent few hours were a haze of hectic endeavor. Heather was in her domain, converting our residence into a protective stance. I was her eager, if slightly frightened, partner. We rigged activation cords to movement-triggered irrigators and spotlights. We established internal recorders in every chamber. We bolstered the entrances. She instructed me how to generate a constriction point in the corridor. While she labored, I made 2 contacts. The initial was to Trevor. Exit your residence immediately, I informed him. Proceed to a inn. Don't inquire queries. Just proceed. He commenced to stammer, to alarm, but I interrupted him. Trevor, believe me. He went mute for an instant. All right, Mark, be secure. The second contact was to the district lawman's dispatch. I didn't document an offense. I documented a suspicion. My title is Mark Miller. I stated composedly. My spouse and I believe we are being aimed by our HOA. We've had menaces. We believe they may attempt to injure us or our belongings this evening. I'm just requesting you to place it in the record. We possess recorders and we will protect ourselves. It was a lawful safeguard. It placed us on document. It ensured that when the turmoil commenced, the authorities wouldn't perceive us as the assailants. The snare was established. The lure us was in position. All that was remaining was to await for the beasts to materialize, and I recognized with a assurance that chilled me to the marrow that my sibling would not fail. The await was the worst component. Every squeak of the residents, every rustle of foliage outside dispatched a shock of energy through my framework. We perched in my workspace, the control hub, the radiance of a dozen recorder transmissions illuminating our strained. This ages, Heather was a monument of composed concentration, her respiration sluggish and uniform. I sensed like a container of carbonated drink that had been agitated for 60 minutes. The eavesdropper in the thug's automobile was still operational. We heard them encountering Karen in an obscure corner of the area. We heard her providing them 2 fuel containers and a collection of entry tools. We heard her ultimate directives. Make it appear convincing. Commence it in the storage and ensure they don't exit. Then the automobile entrance is shut, and there was only the noise of the motor. They commenced driving toward our residence toward us. My grasp was trembling. Heather placed her grasp over mine. It was warm and stable. Remain concentrated, she stated. You recognize your task. My task was to be the storyteller, to perch at the control hub and utilize the residence's announcement setup, which we typically utilize to broadcast tunes, to bewilder and guide them, to be the spirit in the apparatus. Heather's task was everything else. At 2:13 a.m., they materialized. The pale automobile stationed down the road, its illuminations off. Two figures, Donnie and Frank, exited, carrying the fuel containers. They progressed mutely across the grass, their shapes captured in crystal-lucid night sight by our recorders. They evaded the forward entrance just as Heather forecasted they would, and proceeded for the lateral entrance leading into the storage. Frank, the more seasoned one, knelt and commenced labor on the fastener. It took him 30 seconds. The entrance clicked open. They glided inside. They were in. Performance time, Heather murmured. The instant they were both in the storage, I pressed a control on my input device. A robust magnetic fastener on. Interior of the entrance activated with a loud bang. They were ensnared in the storage. They whirled around, realizing their departure was absent. What was that? Donnie whispered. The entrance shut. Frank yelled, shaking the grip futilely. Then I pressed the second control. The storage was immersed into total darkness as the illuminations extinguished, and an elevated frequency flashing light, the type designed to confuse, commenced to blink irregularly. Simultaneously, the announcement setup speaker in the storage crackled to existence. I inclined into the amplifier. Gentlemen, I stated, my voice electronically reduced to a profound, threatening rumble. Welcome to the celebration. We've been anticipating you. They alarmed. It was magnificent. They staggered around in the flashing obscurity, colliding into implement chests and each other. It's him, Donnie shrieked, the fellow from the parking zone. From a recorder inside the storage, I could observe Frank recovering his poise. He extracted a firearm from his belt. It was a Glock. Unregistered Glock. I'd wager my existence on it. Quiet, Donnie. Acquire the fuel. He yelled. We're incinerating this location immediately. This was the instant Heather was awaiting. They thought the danger was the secured entrance behind them. They had no notion the genuine danger was the entrance in front of them, the one leading into the residence. That entrance swung open. Positioned in the threshold, outlined by the corridor illumination behind her, was Heather. She was attired in operational equipment. She grasped a non-fatal impact device, an apparatus that discharges a compressed atmosphere explosion, strong, sufficient to knock a male off his feet. She appeared like something from a futuristic combat film. You're in infringement of Regulation 12, she stated, her voice composed and stable. No combustible substances in an unauthorized vessel. Frank reacted on impulse. He elevated his firearm and discharged. One blast, but Heather was already progressing. The blast went astray, piercing an opening in my labor surface. Before he could discharge again, she discharged the impact device. It produced a noise like a Titan's hack, a profound boom. The explosion of atmosphere struck Frank directly in the torso. It elevated him off his feet and hurled him backward into the storage barrier. He struck it firmly and glided to the ground, the firearm rattling from his grasp. He was stunned, the breath expelled from him. Donnie, observing his associate subdued, made a deadly error. He hurled his fuel container at Heather. It was an awkward, eager action. She evaded it effortlessly. The container struck the ground, spilling petrol everywhere. The vapors filled the atmosphere, and then Donnie extracted his own firearm, but he never got to employ it. Heather was on him in an instant. It was like observing a haze. One instant she was by the entrance, the next she was atop him. There was an arm hold, a sharp rotation. Donnie screamed as his firearm was removed from his grasp. She utilized his own velocity against him, dispatching him whirling into a heap of vacant color containers. From my control hub, I pressed the ultimate control for the storage. A blaze suppression setup, the type utilized in commercial cooking areas, activated in the overhead. A cloud of dense white froth rained down, covering the spilled petrol, the thugs, everything. It was concluded in less than a minute. 2 armed hoodlums nullified, unarmed, and covered in flame-suppressant froth. Heather positioned in the threshold, unscathed, grasping their 2 firearms. She inspected her timepiece. Then she gazed up at the recorder in the corner of the storage and provided me a small wink. The entrance chime rang, not the ordinary entrance chime. A mute alert that vibrated my device. I gazed at the forward veranda recorder. Karen. She was positioned there in her nightgown, an enraged expression on her visage, undoubtedly pondering why her fire starters were taking so extended. She commenced pounding on the entrance, and behind her, at the termination of the road, I observed the flashing azure and crimson illuminations. The lawmen, responding to the noise of the firearm discharge that our residents had undoubtedly documented, were materializing. The snare hadn't just captured the subordinates, it had captured the monarch too. The consequences was a magnificent, turbulent disorder. The lawmen's subordinates swarmed our estate, their visages a blend of bewilderment and amazement. They discovered Donnie and Frank drenched and covered in froth, whining in our storage. They discovered the fuel containers. They discovered the 2 unregistered Glocks that Heather had neatly positioned on the cover of my vehicle. They discovered Karen on our forward veranda, shrieking that we had attacked her workers. Then I opened the entrance, passed the lead subordinate a memory stick, and stated, "Good dusk, officer. I believe this recording will clarify everything." We perched at our cooking surface while subordinates took our declarations. Heather was the image of composure. I was humming with remaining energy. We could hear Karen outside still yelling, her voice becoming increasingly frantic as the restraints went on. They placed her in the rear of one vehicle and her froth-covered thugs in the rear of another. The subordinate in command, a weathered sergeant with a fatigued visage, returned inside after viewing the recording on his portable computer. He gazed from the display to me to Heather and then back to the display. He agitated his cranium gradually. In 20 years on the position, he stated, "I have never observed anything like this. You too, you're remarkable." He gazed at Heather. "Ma'am, your spouse stated you were a Green Beret trainer." Heather affirmed, "Near quarters fighting and tactical protection." She stated simply. The sergeant just groaned, an expression of deep esteem in his gaze. He finally comprehended he wasn't dealing with a typical suburban duo. The finest component, our proof was pristine. The recorders were on our estate. The thugs were intruding. They had brought armaments and igniters. They had discharged the initial blast. We had acted in self-protection. It was a model instance and conclusive victory. The memory stick contained everything. The storage assault, my poisoned flowers, the HOA hoodlum seizing my parcel, Trevor's title investigation, plus the unacceptable eavesdropper recording naming the superior David Sterling. I passed it to the sergeant. "Consider it a guide," I stated. He affirmed and departed with the crucial. By dawn, Serenity Oaks was charged. Subordinates restrained Karen and her froth-drenched thugs. The HOA resources were immobilized, and the charter disbanded within days. Trapped, Donnie and Frank betrayed Karen, and she, in complete collapse, betrayed my sibling. A municipal special team invaded David's luxury apartment, discovering the document path. He'd financed Karen to frighten the area, reduce costs, then demolish it all for a vanity enormous property on my plot. Pure brotherly malice. Now he confronts a pile of serious crimes that should keep him incarcerated for decades. We never conversed. There's nothing remaining to utter. Serenity Oaks is fulfilling its title again. The Soul Group organizes the neighborhood celebration. Last evening, Heather and I perched on the veranda, fresh flower shrubs flowering under Bartholomew, the gnome's vigilant smirk. "It's calm," she murmured. I compressed her grasp. Equity prevailed, and so did the silent existence we arrived here.